everybody, I'm Cecilia Lee. He is the author of 2 national bestsellers. He's also the investigative journalist who reported on the largest merger in US history, the merger between AOL and Time Warner, at an estimated value of close to $200 billion. His stories led to investigations by the US Department of Justice and the Securities and Exchange Committee. The merger was announced in 2000. He did his investigations and published a series of stories between the year 2001 and 2, and what followed in 2003, the merger collapsed. He later put all his reporting into a book called Stealing Time. It was published the same year that the merger collapsed, and has since become a national bestseller. It received worldwide critical acclaims and was translated into different languages. It's now even a required text at a number of business schools. Alex Klein, award-winning investigative journalist and author, I recently sat down with him to talk about many things, including his investigation on the AOL Time Warner merger, the impact those stories has had on his personal life, what's it like to be an investigative journalist, and more.
The merger of the #1 internet company with the #1 media company will bring together the best of both worlds.
In January 2000, America Online and Time Warner announced the largest merger in US history, a deal that would create the biggest media company in the world. In 2001, you received a phone call from someone you never met telling you about the resignation of an AOL executive, and you started investigating the merger. Back to 2001, Alex, why did you do these stories?
Well, I think you're giving a good background for the stories, but what happened was somebody called my office and had a tip that someone had been suspended from the company. Someone got in trouble, and the person on the phone wouldn't give me his name, wouldn't give me his telephone number. He hung up the phone. So I was curious, and I started to call different people, and I was able to confirm that an executive had been suspended. It had something to do with accounting. It involved another company that was based in Las Vegas, .com. And I didn't know much more than that, but I was curious, so I decided I would pursue this story to learn more. And as I called more and more people, I kept running into dead ends. But eventually I called someone up, and I said, "This is Alex Klein of the Washington Post." And the person on the phone said, "How did you find me?" And I didn't know I had found anyone until he said, "How did you find me?" And then I realized that he was the person, the tipster who had called me initially. And eventually I met him, and that opened up a lot of doors, and I met a lot of other people, and I began to collect a lot of documents.
Right.
These were confidential, secret documents, and these documents explained how AOL was inflating its advertising revenue to show growth at a time when the .com industry was actually beginning to collapse, but before everyone in the world knew this. And the reason why AOL was doing this was because it was in the process of acquiring Time Warner, as you pointed out, to create the largest media company in the world. And if it had been known that AOL's advertising revenue was actually slowing in growth, Time Warner could have pulled out of the deal, and it would have collapsed the entire merger. So I did this investigation for a year, and over this time, I brought my findings to AOL, and I said, please explain to me what's happening here. They immediately hired a law firm to try to kill the stories before publication, and they basically said that you're wrong, that there's nothing wrong with what we've done, and if you write those stories, there's going to be a big problem.
Right.
Nonetheless, we went ahead and published the stories.
So, you talked to a lot of people, obviously, right, in the process, and was it over 2 years that took you for?
Well, from the time that I began reporting on AOL to the time that I finished the book, one was more than 2 years actually. So there was a tremendous amount of reporting that went into it, and I had sources all over the place throughout the company, throughout the industry. So it made the book a lot easier to do because a lot of people spoke to me for the book.
And I presume you would have gotten to know them quite well as well.
I did. I got to know a lot of people very well. It was a very interesting time.
So you said in your book, I quote unquote, these folks were risking a lot. If AOL found out that they were talking to me, they might have been fired. Why do you think that they were willing to give you all these informations?
The sources who were speaking to me wanted to make sure that they were not discovered. And so in many cases, I met them at hotel lobbies in very sort of distant locations. Usually these were very bad hotels where they wouldn't be seen by people they knew. Sometimes I met them in very bad restaurants where again they would not be seen. And they also insisted that I not call them from the Washington Post because they were concerned that my telephone calls would be traced back. And so I spent a lot of time reporting and calling people from an unnamed hotel in Washington. And I spent many months in this hotel lobby, and I would ask for change at the gift shop to use the public telephone booth to call people from the public telephone booth, and they always looked at me strangely because I had my cell phone. And
yet, thought that you were a drug dealer.
That's right, exactly.
Right?
So, but I asked my sources why they were telling me the things that they were telling me, and I think it's fair to say that they didn't enter the business world to do improper things. They wanted to do interesting things. They wanted to, maybe change the world even. And when they were forced into situations that they were uncomfortable with and involving the inflation of their advertising revenue, I think they felt betrayed that this was something that they didn't want to do, and they felt that someone needed to know that this was going on.
So then I guess for you, because you were the person that told the stories, and you were the person that made the call to AOL. So if you yourself or your family has ever been blackmailed as a result of the stories you published?
No, not at all. The funny thing actually was while I was doing the interviewing and the research for these stories and the investigation, as I said, there was a lot of pressure from AOL. They tried to kill the stories, and they put a lot of fear into people involved in these stories. But after the stories were published, actually I got a phone call. I think it was the day of the first story that ran in the Washington Post, and it was from an AOL executive who said, "Congratulations." And I was surprised that he was saying congratulations, but I said, "Well, what do you mean?" He said, "Well, you looked into the jaws of death, and you came out okay." And I think AOL they tried their best to prevent the stories from being published, but in the end, I think they felt that we were fair in how we treated them in the stories, because we gave AOL 6 weeks to respond to the allegations, and we included their responses throughout the series. And before long, I was receiving Christmas cards again from AOL executives.
In your view, do you think that the AOL Time Warner merger would have succeeded, and what would it take?
Some of it had nothing to do with business. Some of it had to do with sort of petty personality issues, which you wouldn't think would affect the largest media company in the world, but it does. So, for instance, after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, I'm doing this from memory now, Steve Case wanted to hold a meeting, but Jerry Levin didn't, because Jerry was upset about what had happened, and he was really turned off by the fact that Steve Case wanted to hold a meeting anyway. And they just didn't get along. And some of that had to do with just personalities. But that seeped throughout the organization. So a lot of the people at Time Warner didn't like the people at AOL. And a lot of the people at AOL didn't like the people at Time Warner. And it was like a bad marriage, where they couldn't get along. And a lot of it had to do with egos. The AOL people were viewed as sort of, the nouveau riche or the new money, and the Time Warner people were viewed as sort of old and stodgy. And so when they had to work together, they couldn't do it. And I think to make it work, they would have had to do something to create a different culture. And when you're dealing with mergers, that's often very difficult to do because it's not uncommon for two different cultures, corporate cultures, to come together and clash in some manner. In this case, it was a little more extreme because the problems were at the top and throughout the organization. But there were other problems too. One of the problems, in retrospect, is that AOL didn't stay on top, and they didn't know how to stay on top. Search engines obviously became big. AOL had some tremendous assets like instant messaging, but nowadays a lot of people are using different kinds of communications, texting for instance, which serves some of the same functions. So part of the problem had to do also with strategy. And then the third element I think that was a problem was that it took the two companies a year to get the US government's approval to get the merger done. So during that 1 year, there was a lot of distractions. And so instead of worrying about business, they were fighting with the government. And again, egos got in the way. There was one instance when Steve Case, the head of AOL, was asked to come to speak to US government attorneys who were not paid very well, but were in a position of authority. And he was dismissive during this meeting. He put his feet up on the table, and then he left abruptly. And they didn't appreciate that. And in the end, the US government was very tough on both AOL and Time Warner to make sure that this big company wouldn't dominate the whole media landscape. But the problem for AOL and Time Warner was that they were focused more on the US government than on creating new business. And if they had spent more time worrying about how to create good media products, new movies, new music, new magazines, new television, CNN, they might have come up with some better solutions.
Coming back, we're going to learn more about the person behind Stealing Time and what it's like to be an investigative journalist. We'll be back. So people are interested to find out more about the person behind Stealing Time. Can you tell us about your childhood and growing up in New York?
Sure. I was the son of a journalist he was the editor-in-chief of the New York Times Magazine. And he also wrote many books. So I grew up with journalism as a child and learned to report from an early age. I was writing for my school newspaper in high school and was writing for publications in college, and I've been doing it ever since. So I've always been a writer.
There seems to be two groups of people when it comes to finding one's calling. There are those who have always known what their passion is and have been doing it since a very early age. Then there are the ones who spent years going through soul searching and trying different things before they find their calling. Are you the former or the latter?
I'm definitely the former. I've always known I've been a writer. From an early age as a child, I've always been a writer. I don't even think it entered my mind to do anything else, really, except to be a writer. I've always been a writer. It's my identity.
Did it go back to as early as when you were 5 years old?
I'm not sure exactly what age, but even as a small child, I used to write stories, and I always loved creating new stories and writing stories and telling stories. So I've been doing it from the very beginning. So it was never a question after college that I would go into journalism. This was what I was going to do. So.
Great. So Stealing Time is at the interesting intersection of business and investigative journalism. Have you always had an interest in business?
No, I sort of fell into it. I was a reporter in Virginia early on in my career, and I was asked to become a business reporter at the Baltimore Sun even though I didn't have any experience as a business reporter, but they hired me because they thought I was a good writer and a good reporter, and they figured that I could learn. And when I was at the Baltimore Sun, the same thing happened where the Wall Street Journal wanted to hire me not because of any kind of real business experience, but because they thought I was a good reporter and a good writer, and that I would learn on the job. So I joined the Wall Street Journal and have been doing it ever since.
What does it take to be a successful investigative journalist?
Persistence.
Merely persistence?
Well, it's a big part of it. I teach investigative reporting here at Northwestern, and there are a lot of techniques, and there are, sort of documents to find, but when you boil it down, it really comes down to the ability to pursue something in the face of adversity. So can you accept repeated failure and continue to forge ahead? Will you continue to push forward even when everything looks difficult? And for a lot of people, that's not what they want to do. But for the best investigative reporters that I know, they're known for being persistent and finding a way to find the information against great odds.
Tell us one experience where you had to really just push through and move mountain and earth to get what you want.
I don't know if you remember, but several years ago, Bridgestone Firestone's tires were a problem, and people were the tires were, I think, exploding on the highways, and people were getting injured. And the company, Bridgestone Firestone, was under tremendous pressure during this period. And I was a new reporter at the Washington Post. My editor said, "Well, go get an interview with the CEO." And when I called the company, they laughed at me and said, "He's not talking to anyone in the media at all." So instead of accepting that as an answer, I took an airplane to Bridgestone Firestone's headquarters in, I think it was, where was it? Maybe Nashville or somewhere like that. They didn't know that I was going to be arriving. And I went to their headquarters and I knocked on their door and I said, I'd like an interview, and they told me to go away. They were shocked that I was there. And they said, "You didn't tell us you were coming, you weren't invited, we told you we were not going to let you do an interview with the CEO. Go away." But instead of going...
ever even escort you out of the building?
Well, they could have easily, but they didn't. Instead, I got back into my car, rented car, and I went to the mall, nearby mall, and I bought some nice chocolates. And then I went back to the headquarters.
Need a little bit pick me up.
Well, I brought the chocolates back to the headquarters, and I sent a little note, and I put it with the chocolates, and I sent it up to the CEO of the company,
okay.
And also to the head of their public relations, and then I fell asleep on their couch in the lobby of Bridgestone Firestone for a couple of hours, I think. And then I was awoken by the head of public relations of the company, and she was still saying that they wouldn't talk to me, but they were a little bit nicer about it. And I explained to them how important it was that they agree to this interview, and I explained that this was an opportunity for Bridgestone Firestone to explain what was happening, and they ultimately agreed to that. And so I got back on the airplane, and in the end, the Washington Post had the first interview with the CEO exclusive before anyone else during this crisis, and it was really because of persistence, and there's no great secret about that, but for a lot of investigative reporters, it's about taking those risks and then hoping that it works out.
Mm-hmm.
So
it sounds like that there is often times where people will say no to you,
mm-hmm.
and you have to be completely comfortable with people telling you no, no, and no.
Yes, there's a lot of no. There's a lot of rejection, and you do have to be comfortable with that and not be too discouraged by it. But you also have to be polite but persistent. And so, you have to accept that there's a lot of failure and that you have to forge ahead anyway. And some people, they don't like that,
mm-hmm.
But for investigative reporters, it's part of the job.
Mm.
So.
How many times would you give it a try before you give up?
It depends on every situation. Every situation is different, but you know, another example was the Surgeon General of the top doctor of the United States wouldn't agree to an interview with me when I was a reporter at the Baltimore Sun. And I tried, various methods, and they said no, 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 and no. So I decided to make a special trip to Washington, D.C. one weekend when I knew that the Surgeon General would be in a parade marching. And I waited for him in the middle of a cordoned off street where people were waiting on, the sidelines, because I knew eventually he would have to march in my direction. And eventually the Surgeon General was marching towards me, and I went up to him and I said, I know that your people have said that I can't have this interview, but I really would like to speak to you because of the importance of this issue. And I think he may have been a little bit alarmed that I was there in the parade, but he agreed to the interview, and it was important because during the interview he explained why he thought cigars were dangerous to people's health, and that there should be a warning label on cigars, which was tied to an investigation that I had done about cigars for the Baltimore Sun. So again, you don't know how many times you have to accept the answer no, but there are times when it will be a no as a permanent answer, but you have to keep pushing forward, and sometimes it turns around.
Mm-hmm. So you obviously had a fantastic education. I want to go back to your schooling
Sure.
a little bit. You went to Stuyvesant for high school.
That's right.
And I think the acceptance rate is at 3%.
3% of those who take the test get in.
So when you finished with Stuyvesant, you went on to study at Brown,
That's right.
an Ivy League school.
Yes.
Do you see yourself as an overachiever?
Not really. I think I view myself as having achieved because I had every advantage to achieve. I
Talk about some of those advantages.
I grew up, in a comfortable home where if I needed help to learn a topic, I would get help with tutoring. So I was given every advantage to succeed. And if I didn't succeed, I think it would have been a major failure,
There's really no option.
I don't think so. I think if I had not, achieved at a high level, it would have been, I don't think I would have had any good excuse for that. But I'm more impressed with people who don't have those advantages but still achieve anyway. And I know, many students here at Northwestern and other schools who have achieved greatness with no advantages at all. I had many advantages, and so I was expected to achieve, and I should have achieved, and I did achieve, but it was no great achievement to do well.
Right. Both of your books, Stealing Time and A Class Apart,
Yeah.
which was published in the States in 2007,
Yeah.
were translated into Chinese.
They were, yes.
Can you talk a little bit about how that came about?
In both cases, my agent in the United States was approached by Chinese publishers. We had not sought it out in any fashion, but I'm very glad that the Chinese publishers were interested, and in both cases, the books were translated into Chinese. And in fact, my most recent book, A Class Apart, which is the book about Stuyvesant High School in New York City, has sold very well in China. I don't really know why, but I think I'm speculating, but the book is about a school in New York City that is majority Asian, including many Chinese Americans. And in fact, some of the main characters in the book are Chinese. But the story is also about what is it about this one school in America what makes it so successful? And I think that, it's part of Asian culture, but education is so important in China and in Asia. And I think perhaps there's some curiosity or interest in what makes this school successful, and, what could they learn in China from it. But I'm glad that there's interest in both, this school in New York, and also with this Time Warner merger. I think that the reason for the first book, Stealing Time, being published in Chinese is because, AOL Time Warner, or Time Warner now, is not just the largest media company in the world, but Chinese people are consuming the same media products that we are here in the United States through the movies, through the music, the magazines, the CNN, all these different media outlets, and so they're equally influenced. And plus, it's a business story, and as you know, business in China is becoming very big and international. So, but it's been a pleasant surprise that both books have been translated into Chinese, and but I think the future is a good thing for China now. So I personally think it's a great story. So, but I loved my time there. I loved the food, loved the culture, and
Love the people.
I did love the people. Yes, I did.
That's not something shameful to say.
No, I found the Chinese people to be very appealing. So, So this is the Chinese translation of Stealing Time. My most recent book was A Class Apart, and it's about a public high school in New York City for high-achieving students. They have to take a test to get into the school. The book was did very well. It was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award, and I'm glad it was translated into Chinese and has sold well in China as well.
So that was my recent interview with Alex Klein. I'm Cecilia Lee with Suncast TV. As always, we welcome comments, questions, or suggestions of interview guests. If you have them, please send them to my mailbox at cecilia.lee23@yahoo.com. The spelling is CECILIA.LI23@yahoo.com. I hope you enjoyed what you saw. See you next time.